our panel on power sharing and the resource curse. We will be focusing on 3 countries, 2 oil and gas producing countries, that is Libya and Iraq, and 1 potential oil and gas producing country, that is Lebanon. And we will discuss how to share power in the context of societies and economies almost exclusively governed, so to speak, by the extraction and export of natural resources. What kind of polity, what kind of regime does it entail? What are the socio-economic dynamics at play, including the gender dimension, if possible. We will also try to tackle some of the geopolitical implications pertaining to the management of the extractive sector. But just before turning to our panelists, I'll just make sure that we all understand what in the scientific literature we refer as the resource curse. The resource curse, we know that oil and gas countries fall easily into a trap called the resource curse. That is a kind of economy, of underperforming economy, paradoxically. The oil wealth and gas wealth becomes a curse. It harms the economy, which becomes underproductive, which underperforms. It is viewed as an impediment to economic growth and development because of a trend toward uncontrolled government spending, public spending, and borrowing in some cases. And this in turn has an impact on the non-gas and oil sectors, that is the agriculture and the manufacturing sector. This is explained by economists because of the appreciation of the national currency, because of the huge increase in the oil and gas sector revenues. This pushes the national currency towards an increasing pattern. And then this makes exports more difficult, and of course, imports become cheaper, and particularly food imports. So it has a global debilitating effect on the economy. It only boosts one sector and deprives the other remaining sectors of any kind of performance. The resource curse was first conceptualized by economists who studied the Dutch economy from the early 1960s onwards, when huge gas fields were discovered in the Netherlands. They just realized that this became a curse on the Dutch economy as it debilitated the manufacturing sector. It provoked some kind of deindustrialization of the Dutch economy. And therefore, in this concept, the paradigm of the Dutch disease was later on applied to the Gulf, the GCC countries, and basically to all other oil and gas economies. So I will just briefly introduce our panelists. We have, unfortunately, one of our panelists couldn't make it to Beirut today, Mohamed Eljarh. So we will start maybe with Libya, if that's okay with you. So shall we start with Libya, then Iraq, and maybe Lebanon? We conclude by Lebanon? Okay. So Zahra Langhi, from Libya. She is a prominent civil society activist. She is also the co-founder of the Libyan Women's Platform for Peace, which was founded in 2011. She has also played a very important role in the transition process in Libya, trying to pressure international stakeholders and Libyan political actors to take into consideration a gender dimension in the transitional process, and to include women and try to advance their rights in the very complicated context of a war economy and political violence. So Zahra will start with Libya, and then we will turn to Iraq and Lebanon. Zahra.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this invitation, and I hope that this will turn out to be an interesting session. We already had an interesting talk while you had your lunch, and I look forward to the discussion. As I was saying earlier, there's a statement here, already statement that the natural resources are considered a curse and an impediment to development and growth. While people may contest that, I have with me to start to kick the discussion two interesting quotes. One by the late King Idris Sunusi of Libya, when in the late 50s, when they discovered oil in Libya, and Libya in the 50s was a really poor country. King Idris said, "I wish you people had found water. Water make people work, oil make people dream." His statement remains today true, except that oil today does not result in dreams, but nightmares, as we see the struggle in Libya. Another quote I thought of sharing with you is by Sadiq al-Nayhoum, a philosopher in Libya who passed away in the early 90s. And so this quote is actually in the 60s of Sadiq al-Nayhoum, and he's a leftist. He said, "And then came the oil, which has certainly saved us from starvation amongst our neighbors, but it has not saved us from our old problems. Nations do not mature with money." And this quote in particular is interesting because we all know that the literature, what we have written, especially in the English language, literature on Libya is rather scarce. But the literature, what we have on Libya, share the narrative that Libya is the product of oil industry. And in Libya, it is the oil companies that decided to unify Libya, and the modern nation state as we know it today is the product of oil. This is a narrative. However, with the quote of Sadiq al-Nayhoum, which I sentence, believes that nations do not mature with money. It means that there's a nation-building process, and the nation-building process is not a result of oil or oil interests. The statement here, as I was saying, of this panel is that oil and natural resources is a curse. And if we look into the history of Libya, we had a short period of what we call the independent state, which lasted for 19 years. In this period, most of it, Libya was poor, but in that period, it witnessed the development of its institutions, state institutions. Libya was under the Italian occupation, and so there was a development. The development, of course, when you have such a geography as Libya with a small population or demography, and with natural resources like Libya matters too much for its neighbors and for regional powers. And after the transition, which came after 4 decades of brutal dictatorship, this intervention or interference by regional and international powers has made people less stable. We all know that Libya, since 2011, has a political mission. However, the question of equal distribution of wealth was never put on fully, let's say, and directly on the table of negotiation and in peace processes. And then I'm saying this out of my experience, as I have participated in the peace process in Libya, but the agenda was primarily about power sharing, about whatever that means, and I think all of us will try to unpack what this framework means, what power and how to share. Is it what we call it in Arabic al-muhasasa? Is it about appeasing warlords? Is it about distributing the cake? So it was basically framed as advancing a political solution contrary to a military solution. But other issues of socio-economic roots of the conflict up to this moment have not been brought to the table. So with this mismanagement of Libya's transition by the UN up to this moment, by the political mission, with also with the legacy, heavy legacy of statelessness during Gaddafi, and I would say that the region as a whole has a tradition of doesn't have a proper nation states. And I think that the elephant, and I was sharing this earlier, the elephant in the room today is nation states and the transforming of the nation states. We call it power sharing, but what needs to be addressed is the concept of statehood. And statehood, we never had the same experience as in the West, which after a period of conflict and war, you had a power, a consensus building process, and that yielded into a nation state. What we had basically two kinds of nation states, two kinds of states, a rentier state and a military rule. One that monopolizes power, and the other that or force, and the other that monopolizes wealth. In the case of Libya, and I think in the case of Iraq as well, we have rentier military rules for 4 decades. And so this legacy needs to be addressed through certain steps, and we start with an inclusive dialogue, a bottom-up dialogue on addressing the equal distribution of wealth. I have I don't want to take more time, but there are certain steps that needs to be taken if we think of a power sharing model that really shares wealth and that is really includes everybody in the discussion. But I will leave it later on. But this is the main cause. It's the legacy of the state that we had in the region. States did not have legitimacy of establishing development, but as I said, it's rentier or military rule, and the mismanagement by the international community during the transition. So there are serious problems that need to be addressed, and I think let's take from everyone and we'll come back.
Okay, so we are moving immediately to Iraq, where since 2003, Iraq has been experiencing several models, let's say, of power sharing, be it insurgency, armed struggle, separatism, or some kind of consensual model of sharing power. And my colleague Harith Hasan has written extensively on Iraqi politics since the overthrow of Saddam's regime. He is a political scientist by training, and he has mainly focused on state-society relations in Iraq, and particularly on identity politics and what has been come to be termed as the sectarian model of power sharing, which has been pushed to its extreme limits in Iraq in comparison with Lebanon. Iraq is an accomplished model of sort of semi-stable, semi-unstable polity based on identity politics and power sharing. And here, I think Harith will probably discuss this in greater detail when we deal with power sharing in the Middle East. We tend to focus on ideas, on politics, on sectarianism, but what is at stake is basically a formula of sharing wealth. That is the most important aspect behind sectarianism. Harith, please.
Thank you, Loulouwa. As you said, for obvious reasons, Iraq is an interesting case for this panel. On the one hand, Iraq is a typical rentier state. 90% of the governmental revenue is coming from oil exportation. That is almost 50% or more than 50% of the GDP. On the other hand, Iraq has been a country in which some models of power sharing were experienced since 2003. And probably it's time to try to figure out whether these models were successful or not. And in general, in literature dealing with the rentier state, there is a consensus that in countries where there have been strong and efficient institutions before the discovery or exploitation of resources, these countries managed to mitigate the negative effects of the resource dependence and managed to govern their own resources successfully and in a transparent way. And this is typically the case of Norway. But in countries where these institutions were not in place, where the dependency on oil has been evolved before starting to build democratic institutions and share power, it is most of the examples, most of the cases indicate that the models of power sharing were not successful. And Iraq could be placed here. Iraq could be placed under the category of what some researchers call factional democracy, in the sense that you have democratic institutions, you have constitution that organize and distribute power between institutions, but at the same time you have usually weak government vis-a-vis the interest groups. You have clientelism and provision of patronage as a way of conducting politics. You have highly politicized bureaucracy and judicial system. And the rent is distributed through patronage, through public contracts and corruption. Corruption itself is a tool of distribution of the revenue, and also through public employment, whether in the civil or the military structure. So let me focus more on the Iraqi case. So also some researchers argue that if you compare various resource-dependent states, those who had parliamentary systems were relatively more successful in mitigating the negative effects of dependence on the rent. And Iraq has this parliamentary system. The parliamentary system survived since 2005, despite of the many crises that it went through. And there is some kind of power sharing. But here I want to, and in the previous panel, we had Joseph making very useful distinction between democracy and power sharing. And I want to take this point further and make a distinction between power sharing and power allocation. What we have in Iraq is more politics about allocations. It's not about simply power sharing. And to make to make this distinction, I think power sharing indicates to some degree of inclusivity. Like why we praise power sharing, because we think it's inclusive. And also some degree of responsibility, because we are assuming that those who share power are responsible to each other and responsible to their own constituencies. In the case of allocation, power allocations, we don't have this inclusivity and we don't have this sense of responsibility. So in Iraq today, there are multiple centers of power, yes, and this is a form of power sharing. But at the same time, those centers of power conducting some kind of exclusion within their own constituencies. To give you examples, so you have the various parties. Most of the important parties in Iraq has their own militias, and they have their own positions within the central states or within their own regional or provincial sphere of influence. Let's take Kurdistan as an example. And they allocate resources among them, but there's some kind of balance in which this arrangement is sustained, but at the same time, it doesn't generate mechanisms for responsibility, or transparency. They survive by sustaining and expanding their patronage network. And when the oil prices started to plummet, Iraq was one of the countries that has been affected strongly by that. And there were, for those who were following the news in Iraq, there were more frequent protests in different parts of Iraq. This can be explained also as an outcome of this economic crisis, but also it is because that model is failing to respond to the increasing societal demands. So those parties get used to expand their patronage networks using the state resources. And when the state resources started to decline, they were not able to do so. And there were more and more people trying to have a share in these resources, and they did not find the mechanisms to do so, and therefore they decided to go to the streets and to protest. Another issue here is that we know that in a country that is dependent on oil, especially given the fact that oil is not distributed evenly geographically. So there are provinces and regions that have oils. There are others that don't have it. The central state play an important role as a distributor of the resources, as the intermediary entity between the oil sector and the rest of the economy. And this usually tends to strengthen the grip of the central government on those who control the decision-making within the central government. As a result of that, you have in Iraq some kind of formal decentralization, federalism also. You have federalism is inscribed in the constitution. Decentralization is also written in the constitutions and in different laws. You have local governments, you have provisional governments, and you have regional governments. But at the same time, you have a highly centralized economy in which the central state get the resources and distribute them among the sub-state entities. And therefore, there is this kind of, let's say, incongruency between the economic system and the institutional system that keeps creating tensions. Among those tensions, of course, the dispute between Kurdistan government and the federal government in Baghdad. And this dispute is very interesting because it's largely revolving around the oil issue and the exploitation of oil. Kurdistan decided that it has the right to exploit oil, that is oil fields that are located in Kurdistan. Not only that, it went further to contract foreign companies and foreign countries in order to export that oil. Baghdad disputed this practice, and they considered that it is the power of the central government to manage at least the oil exportation. And here we have a kind of contention between two interpretations of federalism. Baghdad thinks of federalism as a mechanism to delegate powers from the federal government to the regions, and Kurdistan government thinks of federalism as a mechanism to share sovereignty, not just power. We are equal entities, we are not subordinated to Baghdad, and this hasn't been resolved yet. Also, it's in the nature of, as I said, in the nature of RAND-dependent states, is that patronage politics become so dominant in the way the political parties organize their activities. And therefore, we have seen a transformation in the nature of political parties in Iraq. Most of the political parties that are dominant today in the scene initially started as parties with either nationalist or Islamist ideologies opposing the Ba'athist regime. But now they mostly became more like a patronage networks than political parties. They are often revolving around a dominant family or a dominant figure, and working through the patronage networks within state institutions, outside state institutions, in the military sector, in the civil sector. And as a result of that, there is no clear distinctions between the political ideological orientation of each political party. And one outcome of this transformation is that eventually none of these political parties are able to create a grassroots movements, social base, without using patronage, without using clientelism. And when they are unable to use these tools because of the scarce resources, a population will start to mobilize through other alternative ideologies that obviously will most likely tend to clash with the dominant elites. The rent, I mean, when we talk about concessionational democracy, the idea is you have elites that negotiate and compromise in the name of their groups. But in the rentier state, it is the rent that creates the elites. The elites don't come suddenly like that from within the society. But as you see, for example, in the case we talked many times about the Sunni representations in Iraq, most of the Sunni parties were creature of the patronage politics, of the rentier politics, rather of, like the Speaker of Parliament now started his career by having contracts with the US Army, right? So it was you gain, so contrary to other cases, in Iraq, the political power, it creates economic power, not vice versa. It's not the economic power that creates political power. And most of those people started through building through their career from the top level rather than from bottom up. Two more points if I have time. As a result of this process, we have what I call commodification of violence. What does that mean? That means that politics so much focused on extorting resources from the state that political parties and various societal centers of powers began to rely more on extra-legal means to extort those resources. One of those means is by creating militias as a tool to exert pressure over the state, but also as a tool to sustain that fragile balance of power between the multiple centers of power. Two examples is the Kurdish Peshmerga. Kurdish Peshmerga, there is an ambiguous legalization of the Kurdish Peshmerga that recognize that they are the guards of the Kurdistan regions. But in actuality, they operate as the paramilitary arms of their political parties. And the political parties put a pressure on Baghdad to get share of the resources as stipends and salaries for the Peshmerga in order to sustain those Peshmerga and sustain their loyalty to those political parties. The same happened with the Shia militias today. The Shia militias, vaguely defined as a state entity, but in fact they are connected and tied with political parties and political agenda. And they use their military power to extort resources from the state to sustain their autonomy from the state. So it's increasingly blurring the boundaries between the formal and the informal, creating that hybrid domain that is not ruled clearly by any rules. So the written rules are much weaker than the unwritten rules in Iraq. My final point is that the nature of frontier state, and Iraq is also a typical example, is that huge resources are used to build a grand public sector, military and civil, because this is a way also to expand the patronage networks of those dominating the state. So each party brings its own people to get their public positions in order for this party to have more say and more influence within the state machine. As a result of this process, in Iraq today, almost 50% of the workforce working for the state. And 80% of the jobs that were created between 2007 and 2014 were created by the public sector. Public sector became a tool to partly expand the patronage networks of those parties and partly to absorb some of the newcomers to the job market. And in Iraq, there are almost 300,000 newcomers to the job market every year. We're talking about a very young society. Those who are under 24 years, almost 60% of population. The problem here is that, yes, this might be a tool to distribute rent, because each one of those public employees has a family, they are dependent on him, and the salaries they get are used to meet the needs of those families, and eventually you have almost like 20 million people are benefiting directly or indirectly from this mechanism. But the problem here is that by turning the public sector into a tool of just distribution of rent, the public sector became less and less efficient and unable to meet more drastic challenges that the country is facing by time, because it's not operating efficiently. In addition to that, as the country is facing the plummeting of oil prices and the problem of that resources becoming scarier and scarier, less and less, those newcomers to the job market, those who want to get a job in the public sector, cannot achieve their objective, and consequently there will be a deepening division between those who work for the public sector and those who cannot get access to the public sector, and this will become a societal division that will be destabilizing by time. Thank you.
Thank you, Harith. And now Lebanon with Diana Al-Kaissy. Diana is the executive director of the Lebanese Oil and Gas Initiative. And prior to that, Diana has developed a strong expertise on governance of national resources, promoting concepts of transparency and accountability. And she has been working, she has been advancing those objectives from the non-profit sector, organization sector, from civil society, and she, in particular, working for Publish What You Pay, I think previously, so Diana, the Lebanese case, that is a rentier state without an oil and gas rent.
Thank you.
So far. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, and thank you for bearing with us in the afternoon. So let me try to, first of all, before delving into the actual issues here, try to paint the right backdrop for what we're about to say. So Lebanon presents a unique case when we talk about natural resources, power sharing, power distribution. First of all, we need to all agree that Lebanon so far is not an oil-producing country. We don't have oil or gas or any other, natural resources as far as I know. What we have are promising seismic surveys, but until we drill, we will not know. So this is very important for everybody to understand. So we're not. The second thing that we need to understand is that Lebanon, of course, as we all know, is a country that has emerged. It's a post-war, civil war country that have an elitist, I like the term, it's not power sharing, it's power distribution that we have. Exactly, so muhassasa. So this is what we actually have. Add to that, we have other complications, and we haven't even started in natural resources. What we have is a sluggish economic growth. We have a debt to national gross domestic product of 153%. We have pollution, we have garbage crises, we have a lot of issues that we are already dealing with. So if this is the backdrop, how do we propose, or how are we proposing to add or to actually tackle all of these problems? We start delving into the exploration, possible exploration and using of natural resource. Now, if you look at all the history and from where the term resource curse was coined from, it basically states that when you find natural resources, and if you already have a weak institution, absence of good governance principles, the basic ones, transparency, accountability, rule of law, if you have already weak institutions, if you have clientelism, nepotism, I know this is very familiar to the Lebanese, the terms are already there. So if you have all of that, and you come and you say, I want to now go ahead and start exploiting my finite natural resources, you're really marching into a resource curse, whereby you're going to have an increased corruption, an even lower economic growth or no economic growth, and you're going to have conflict. Now, these three things that I have stated, they're not hypothetical, they're very much real. All we have to do is look at countries, just Africa as a continent, I'm going to name one. I can, with the exception of Botswana, which really managed to avoid the resource curse. I can look at so many other countries where the presence of natural resources actually served to only fill the pockets of the very few and to further the conflict in that country. Now, having said that, I want us to really look at the particular case of Lebanon. We decided in 2010 that it is time for us to explore, whether we do have natural resources. And we got the support from international agencies, Oil for Development, the Norwegians, GIZ now is definitely supporting. And the first thing that they worked on, because of the combination of the structure of the power that we have, is the legal framework. So far what we had in Lebanon is a weak legal institutions and legal framework, judiciary. So they sought to have a robust legal framework simply to avoid the spillover of having natural resources and going into the resource curse. So that was the first one. Now, what we see currently is, despite the really earnest efforts to have that legal framework put in place and the regulatory frameworks also being quite active, is that because of the power sharing system or the distribution that we have, is that it's now has divided the country when it comes to natural resource exploration into two strata. It's the elite and the rest of the citizens. Now, how is this being manifested? There is definitely an absence of public involvement in Lebanon when it comes to deciding and developing this very relevant oil and gas sector or nascent sector. So if we follow this through, this will definitely take us into a definite resource curse. In order for us to avoid that resource curse, public consultations, public involvement, activating civil society as an oversight body is mandatory. I've definitely been to Iraq, I'm half Iraqi, and I've definitely been to Libya, and I see that there has always been an absence of involvement of civil society, of the citizens, and getting them to sit on the table to discuss how these natural resources need to be distributed. This has really helped the elite, those that are sharing power, to pocket all the revenues and thus further to contribute to nepotism, clientelism, feeding into their, the rent, supporting the rent. Now, we are bound to have this happen here because the scene, as I just displayed it, is set. Okay, we're moving towards that. But I don't want to be very pessimistic. I want to be optimistic. We have an opportunity. We've seen how this plays out in other countries. And this is exactly the right moment for the Lebanese, for civil society, for the true actors to start acting up, to demand that they're being involved, that they should be involved. We have a supporting environment for this to happen, but we need to be more informed and more engaged in the sector. I believe this is the only way to counter the resource curse. We should also be quite aware that usually resources, when they come and we already have weak institutions, public institutions, then the first thing that is going to collapse are public institutions. It's a heavy sector. It's a really serious sector. It's lucrative, it's volatile, and it comes with a big burden. And it's our only one-time shot to do things right. So if the institutional setup is not right, if transparency is not there, if good governance, if the principles are not there, we're bound to have that institutional collapse. And this will only serve the political elite that are already getting ready to gain. I would like to add also one more concept that I have come across, and I believe this is exactly what is happening in Lebanon. It's not the resource curse, because we still don't have any resources. What we have is a pre-source curse. And this is something that has happened in Mozambique, it has happened in Ghana, it has happened in several other countries, and it is exactly what is happening now. So when a country becomes ambitious or actually has an incline that it might have resources, what happens is that the political elite, they move into having a mismanaged expectations. So they over-expect. In Ghana, what happened when they had at least a commercial discovery, but they did not produce anything yet, they went ahead and borrowed some money, and they got loans. So instead of being, back then, the rising star in 2011 of Africa, they plummeted, their economic growth started plummeting. It is because they didn't manage their expectations. It's because the people started demanding that the government overspend simply because they had the promise of natural resource revenues. And what happened after that? Yes, they did find gas, but again, volatility, that mischievous aspect of natural resources. The prices plummeted, and then Ghana was not able to match or pay back its loans. And now, instead of enjoying what they have, they're really running around with the help of IMF trying to cover their loans. So in Lebanon, the case might be very similar. We are going forward with a lot of promises. We are not really managing our expectations. We are, especially certain political parties are advertising oil as if it's our, messiah. It's the thing that we've been waiting for. It's what we need to all depend on. And this is exactly what we should not be doing. Meanwhile, and from now until we really do make these discoveries, and it's going to take a while, if we do actually start drilling at the end of this year, then it's going to be between 3 to 5 years to make a single commercial discovery, if we are lucky. There's a 20% chance for us from 2 wells to make a discovery. So if we are lucky, then it's going to take another 5 to 6 years to develop. So from now until then, we really have to manage our expectations. We should be more aware. We should not allow the political elite, as I'd like to refer to them, to abuse this stance and to play on the notion of us being an oil-producing country or a new oil producer, as this is being currently said, to serve their own clients or to serve their own position. So for now, I'd like to keep these comments, and I'm sure we're going to have more as we go along. Thank you.
Well, thanks Diana, for reminding us that there's also a resource curse. And Zahra, you said that oil makes people, you quoted, your quote was that oil makes people dream. Oil involves the resource curse. It's also about a lot of fantasies. It's the case in Iraq where people fantasize about the size of Iraqi wealth. When you discuss the mismanagement of public resources in Iraq, people claim that they are, their country is, they are sitting literally on top of oil wells everywhere in the country, and it nourishes an imagination of wealth, and of course it adds more. It adds another level of conflictuality in the country. But I'll start with one question before opening the floor. I think we need to clarify the legal framework. We have seen that in Lebanon, although oil and gas haven't been yet discovered, there has been a series of laws passed by the parliament. In the case of Iraq, since 2003, I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, but there has been no law on the oil and gas sector. No hydrocarbon law has been passed, and I don't know in Libya whether anything has been done since 2011 on trying to clarify the legal framework for the management of the resources, of the national resources.
Okay, I'll comment here since I thought we were still having a discussion. That's why I ended earlier. Well, in the case of Libya, the way I see it, it's not, I'm totally against the institutional approach, that we think that we need to bring about institutional reforms, transparency. I think we need to dig deeper. And that's what I meant by talking about nations, how to build nations. Can we build a nation around a fantasy of that we will bring all these people together based on that they will have a national oil company? No, that's not how we build nation states. That's why I said the problem is in the nation state. And I think we need to reimagine nation states. So that needs a nation building process in parallel to a state building process. A state building process is a process that focuses on the institutional approach. It's more of based on the Weberian perspective, how we imagine the distribution of power, of wealth, but we also need legitimacy. You cannot run a state and you say, okay, we will introduce a perfect model for a legal institutional framework without having the whole idea of legitimacy. And that's the Durkheimian approach. It's a nation-building process, how to reimagine a whole national narrative. And it's more than oil. And we've been in dialogue with civil society, with academics, on how we imagine how to move the country forward. Yani before even drafting a constitution, the way we had it so far after 2011, we had two perspectives or two approaches by the international community. At the beginning, they gave us the blueprint democratization process. You need to have elections, you need to have draft a new constitution where you address these things, how you sell and distribute your oil, and then you need to have political parties and free media and blah, you are now a democracy. And then in 2013, the international community started to question this approach of what I call the toolkit for democracy. And they started thinking of the power sharing model. And we've seen it ever since December 2015, failing miserably after this Khairat agreement, the political agreement. We have an agreement that its philosophy, it said it's based on the political, the power sharing model. It is, yeah, this is what they argued. So they said, we will bring you all together and you share power. And so you have now, instead of elections, you have an appointed presidential council made up of 9 members. And this 9 members, up to this moment, could not, and from 2015 to this moment, they were not able to establish a government. So this power sharing model that was introduced to Libya in 2015 failed miserably and contributed to the stagnation of the country. Maybe we need also to redefine what's power sharing. And so the way I see it is definitely it's state building, vertical process. I was telling you earlier that the whole region needs an establishment of new social contracts. That is a vertical process between states and servants to tackle the issue of the role of the state, centralization, introducing decentralized models, and to develop even, we're radical in Libya, at the moment they're discussing the development of universal basic income, UBI, that each household and family is entitled of a certain percentage of state revenues. I would add to that a power for me, if we're thinking of something that is really sharing and an inclusive political framework, then it has to be also horizontal, and it's about nation building to give legitimacy. It's not only institutional, it's not about institutional frameworks. Legitimacy is important.
Okay, thank you, Zahra. So the floor is open to questions.
مرحبا سؤالي للسيدة زهرة.
I would like to address this question to Ms. Zahra. What do you think about the model that existed in the past with the popular committees, and when the wealth used to be distributed onto the people? Was it a model that is compatible with the Libyan landscape? And what do you think about the current model, especially during the transition period and after agreeing on the Libyan political system?
We'll take 2 other questions and then we'll start. So question on, no?
No power sharing.
No power sharing. Okay, so Zahra, if you'd like to answer the...
عربي. 2 مارس أول أمس تحديد.
On the 2nd of March, 2 days ago, we had a national holiday invented by Gaddafi entitled the People's Authority Day. It was launched by Gaddafi by the end of the 70s when he launched his theory about popularism. As I said in my intervention, Libya is the offspring of this wrong conception of popularism. Gaddafi and most of his supporters claim today that detain their own model of power sharing before we all even started thinking about that. And they say that the power and wealth should be in the hand of the people. But was he applying that? Of course not. Unfortunately, his theory brought the state institutions to a state of collapse, and when they imposed his absolute power over Libya, the entire state collapsed because the model was actually a stateless model. We're talking about redistributing the wealth. Before our session, we were even talking or wondering about this, because the power sharing concept for us is quite ambiguous. It's not coupled with clear-cut mechanisms. We saw how in Harith it failed. They formed a presidential committee with 9 members, all working against each other, and this led to a state of chaos for 7 years without having a real government. We had a makeshift government, and it's still a government structure that's being proposed. You've also talked about the model of democracy and how do we understand democracy and its mechanisms. To this, I would like to add the fact that we need inclusive democracy. One that's based on collaboration and solidarity. And our main mistake in Libya is that we had actually opted for elections based on competition, whereas we didn't have any real parties. We had a rentier state without any real institutions, so even democracy needs institutions. But we cannot manage institutions in a state of vacuum without having a national discourse. So it's all about finding this complementarity between building a state and building a nation. And what I know more about, more than the power sharing model, is democracy with its clear mechanisms, but after the experience of the revolutions and the uprisings that happened after 2011, we have to reiterate the fact that democracy is not only about elections, it's about institutions, and it's also about an open dialogue to discuss the main causes, including which the issue of the just distribution of wealth. And this is what was absent in the peace negotiations sponsored by the United Nations. Now the ESCWA is also sponsoring another socioeconomic dialogue, but it's a way to remedy an error committed years later by concentrating only on the political aspect.
Specific.
كان بدي بس أعلق وخاصة وقت اللي نحكي عن التوزيع.
I just had a quick comment to make, especially when we talk about the just distribution of wealth. We always start with a constant that says that all wealth are the property of the people, but we need to pay attention that we need to add to this the sustainable management of these resources, or the revenues of these resources. And I'm linking this to what you said. When we want to talk about the proper use or the good governance of the natural resources revenues, then we have to make sure not to mix this up with the issue of distribution. We're talking about depleting resources. We're gonna lose them one day, and it's our golden opportunity to use them sustainably. We have the Norwegian experience where there is Norway, the most important sovereign wealth fund with $1.3 trillion of value. And it was established by an Iraqi, by the way, Farouk al-Qasim. And it's something we take pride in. So it's always something to consider and to keep in mind. Ms. Zahra, we have already talked about the need for having this national dialogue in Libya and other countries in order to see how we can properly use and manage these resources in a sustainable fashion. And this is the kind of dialogue that's currently going on in Lebanon, in spite of the fact that we don't have any tangible natural resources yet. But by presenting before the parliament a draft law on establishing a sovereignty fund. And we're having a good deal of interaction, but unfortunately we as civil society and as public opinion, we're not being part and parcel of this discussion or dialogue that should be inclusive whenever we want to ask, what are we going to do with these resources or revenues that we're going to get? Are we going to put that in a sovereignty fund, in a savings sovereignty fund, an investment one? This discussion is not taking place, whereas the law at the same time is sitting on the shelves in the parliament awaiting endorsement. So this is also one of the other activities happening now in Lebanon. As Lebanese initiative on oil and gas, we're not feeling that it's going in the right direction. It has to be inclusive first and foremost. It has to see everyone's participation in this dialogue, and this dialogue has to be built on a strategic vision for the whole oil and gas sector, which is still lacking as well, unfortunately. Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. Okay.
Nadine Gahil, a PhD student, political researcher, the LAU University. You've been all talking about the distribution of power since the early morning, but when it comes to the resource curse, don't you think that the great powers have their own geopolitical interests in the region, in addition to the fact that since 2010, 2011, we've been witnessing the so-called Arab Spring or the Arab winter, and we're witnessing at the global level the presence of two main poles after an era of unipolarity held by the United States. So don't you think that it's a distribution of power, but rather a distribution of influence in order to restrike a balance in the global balance of power? One more question, two questions, and then we'll answer that round of questions. I would like to reiterate what she just asked and add to this a detail regarding Iraq and the influence of the great powers, because, and I'd just like to take 5 minutes to rediscuss the developments in Iraq when the United States was talking about Iraq and the lack of democracy in Iraq. We know that even before invading Iraq, the U.S. had a clear conception about the government to be formed in Iraq. And they had already preconceived the Shalabi government. They attacked Iraq, invaded it, toppled Saddam, and the Americans went out victorious. And then we see how all of the Iraqi people was cheering the American soldiers because it was bringing freedom and democracy. Please go straight to the question, ma'am. So my question is the following. What happened to the Shalabi government? What about democracy and peace in Iraq? Although they said that the American army was ousted, but recently we learned that there are still American soldiers in Iraq, and how can we explain that concept of freedom and democracy in Iraq, whereas we would have on a daily basis 3 explosions taking place? If this is going to happen in Syria as well, after toppling the regime, after they had toppled the Saddam regime, then thank you, we don't want this democracy. One more question.
My question goes to Iraq. How would you dream or visualize from division to unity, especially in the division and the sharing of resources, when what I understood apparently in Iraq, most of the petrol that you have is already sold for the coming 20 years? Thank you.
I don't know. Harith, maybe you want to answer the two questions on Iraq specifically? Before...
خليني أجاوب بالعربي الأول سؤال يعني.
Allow me to answer in English the first question. It was rather a nice speech than a question. You're both talking about geopolitical issues and the influence of foreign powers. And I fully agree with this. I mean, no one doubts that, especially in third world countries and in the Arab region in particular, we are highly affected by the foreign players and foreign influence. Simply by going through the developments that the region has witnessed since this World War II and the Cold War, as well as the rise in neoliberalism, as well as the war in Iraq, its impact on the region. I don't think that anyone would disagree about the influence that the global geopolitical landscape has on our region, because to start with, the state disintegration event is geopolitical by excellence. It leads to a power vacuum that attracts a number of players trying to fill that vacuum from outside the country and within the country as well. But at the same time, the experience we're going through in the region proves as well that rebuilding the social pact, as described by Zahra, as well as the idea of building a state and a nation, at the end of the day, they all require internal dynamics. They all require a real entente between the people and the state, and that the different geopolitical players would reach some kind of formula, some kind of understanding about how to rule the country. Of course, there will be an external influence, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be the sole decisive factor, as these things require an intervention by internal actors as well to play their part. And in Iraq in particular, we moved from a highly centralized state with great control and an economy based on clear orders and instructions to an idea of representation, where all social factions have to be represented. Of course, I can criticize the system in Iraq for hours because it attempted to transform the denominational and religious groups into institutionalized and political entities. So denominations and sects were actually politicized in Iraq, and from representing citizens, we moved to representing denominations. We often praise the issue of inclusivity and social participation, ideas that did not exist in the 50s or 60s, at least in the prevailing fashion. It was more about development and social stability. Now the idea is that whenever we started concentrating much on the issue of representation, we forgot the development aspect of the role of the state. It's rather about including everyone in the power structure rather than bringing real development outcomes. And as a result, this has made the state without a real project, except the fact that it represents the compromises between the different actors.
I don't understand exactly what you meant by Iraqi oil was sold. Iraq is exporting almost 4 million barrels a day today, and it's the revenue, like the last budget was almost 80 billion revenue coming to the government. After 2003, the Iraqi government moved from the one-party domination, that is the state domination of, on the oil sector, into contracting with foreign companies. But we have two kinds of contracts. So the central government, the federal government in Baghdad, made what we call service contracts, in which they contract a foreign company and they give a percentage of the revenue to this, a fixed percentage of the revenue to the foreign company. In Kurdistan, and this takes us back about the problem of the legality, about the legal framework. In Kurdistan, they used another model, which is the sharing contract, in which the Kurdistan regional government and a foreign company make a contract regarding a certain oil field, and the revenue of that oil field is shared between the two. In both models have their pros and cons, but in general, there has to be they disagree about a unified legal framework between the two countries. There are too many technical details I don't want to go through. This is my answer to your question.
Maybe we can take one final question, if there's, yes?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. And my question is really simple and short, and it's about Lebanon and the possibilities of extracting resources from oil and etc. So I view this as kind of opportunity rather than a challenge. So instead of thinking it in a way that, there are a lot of challenges, sure, there is, but instead of, it can be thought as a kind of a catalyst of perhaps political change and kind of maybe trickling down the corruption and scheming. So is there any kind of a process going, and who's leading it? You mentioned civil society, but I feel that it's easier to shift the system when you have, let's say, incentives to change, and you have incentives, let's say, hey, you're not extracting this before, we have all these arrangements figured out, rather than when it's already done and then you're trying to fix it. So, yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's a really good question. Yes, I'm definitely, as I said, I'm optimistic, because this will inadvertently be that sector that will push for the right reform for it to happen. And I'll tell you how exactly. So the ones or the companies that are exploring actually in Lebanon are international ones. It's Total, it's ENI, it's Novatek. Now, I would like to refer to the right order, the operator Total. They do have very robust legal frameworks in their own home country that mandates that they work in environments that are not that corrupt. No, this is the first incentive. So for Lebanon, in order to entice and to open its doors to receive the right international oil companies and to push, because when there is corruption, there's less investments. So in order for us to increase and enhance the investment atmosphere in Lebanon, we have to work on our, fighting corruption, on increasing transparency, and we have actually been doing that. I'll give you 2 examples. So the first one is that Lebanon in 2017, and I just want to refer to the regional impact and the political deadlock that you can enter, because, and it can directly affect the oil and gas sector. So Lebanon between 2013 and 2017 went into such a political deadlock. Nothing was happening. The government would not agree on the ratification of 2 very relevant decrees that, we needed that to move forward on the licensing ground. So, and then suddenly it was resolved in 2017, and we actually still don't know what caused the problem, the halt, and why and how it was resolved. Anyway, it's resolved. So the minute it was resolved, that month of January 2017, at the same time, 2 days after that, the Prime Minister comes out and he says, and we'd like to tell you that Lebanon has signed on to adopt the EITI, which is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Now, this is a global initiative, and it's a tool whereby countries, there are 52 countries so far, and the countries willingly adopt the implementation of such a transparency tool, And because of this implementation or adoption, they enhance and they work on disclosing information related to the oil and gas sector. This type of disclosure and the modus operandi through which EITI is implemented, which is a multi-stakeholder group. And in this multi-stakeholder group, you have representatives from of citizens, civil society, the government, and the companies, and they need to sit together and discuss national priorities and be involved in the ongoings of the oil and gas sector. So, because Lebanon actually went out and said, we want to implement this. This is the first indication that we're going on the right track. And we are indeed following correct measures to become more transparent in the sector. And I say this with a pinch of salt and wariness, because transparency without reform and people working and using transparency is nothing. It is a tool and it is not an end in itself. Now, the second thing that, and is quite promising, is, and it exhibits that there is definitely a willingness from the government and the parliament to be more transparent, is the ratification that was done in October of last year of the law, the transparency law. It's enhancing transparency in the petroleum sector law. And this law basically carries you all across the value chain, from subsoil resources to allocation of rights to management. And it requires, along each and every step of the value chain, of the extractive value chain, that we are transparent. We have contract transparency that is now required by law. And by the way, Lebanon in March 2018 was the first East Med country to publish its signed oil and gas contracts. And it is the 27th in the world. And this is something to be commended. And I believe we are on the right track when we put it this way. There are other mandated requirements in the law that pushes further transparency and accountability. So yes, I am optimistic, and yes, we are taking legal steps towards that end. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I think, power sharing is, as our three panelists explained, is about legitimacy. First of all, it's not about technicalities. It's not about a sort of pre-made kit that could be applied. It is mainly about political legitimacy. It's about involving civil societies, finding mechanisms to involve civil society in the management of national resources. The way it has been done in Iraq and Libya, I would say more than in Lebanon, was through agreements, power-sharing agreements between elite, between politicians, behind closed door, with no accountability, no transparency at all. I think what might save Lebanon is maybe the lack of resources, which puts Lebanon under increased international pressure. This is not the case in Libya and Iraq, because you have oil-rich countries. Violence is self-funded. There's no shortage of funds. You have militias grabbing, oil wells or threatening to stop the exports of oil, and therefore violence could be endlessly funded through nationally. There is no need for external sponsors. When we discuss the oil curse, we tend to forget this aspect, that oil resources, and basically the way it has been done, exiting an authoritarian regime with a very strong grip on power and resources. Iraq has, what allowed Saddam Hussein to become the tyrant was a firm grip on oil resources, and this was served by a very nationalistic discourse, at-ta'mim. There's a governorate in Iraq which is called at-ta'mim. This is to celebrate the nationalization of the oil company in Iraq. So in Libya, again, there was a firm grip on a firm monopoly on oil resources under Gaddafi, and what both states have lost since regime change is basically very precisely the monopoly over national resources, and this is triggering and making violence and a constant pattern of politics in those two countries, unlike Lebanon, and luckily so. So I would like to please join me in thanking our three panelists.